Good morning. Once again, Clean Lakes Alliance is virtual Yahara Lakes 101 Lake Science Cafe. I'm James Ty, founder and executive director of the Clean Lakes Alliance. For the first time last month, we took these popular science talks virtual as we maintain social distancing. Once again, we have roughly over 100 people joining us from around the greater Madison area and the state. Even though we're virtual, I want to thank our sponsors right now. First of all, presenting sponsors, Johnson Financial Group, First Weber Foundation, supporting sponsor, National Guardian and Life Insurance Company. Usually our hosting sponsor, the Edgewater, were gracious for their past and continued service towards us. The University of Wisconsin Nelson Institute for Environmental Studies, and finally our media partner, the ISMIS. Our monthly sponsor for June is Task. Now just a few housekeeping and announcements. First of all, our popular Loop the Lake bike ride starts this upcoming Monday. We're going virtual this year, and we're encouraging people to bike, run, walk, paddle, whatever course they set around the greater Madison area and the country. All residents get a free Land's End t-shirt, and kids under 10 get a free t-shirt with the adult entry. There it is right there on the left. It's a great shirt this year. Even the event runs from Monday the 15th through Father's Day, June 21st. We'll send you a link to sign up, or you can go to cleanlakesalliance.org right now and register. We'd also like to thank everybody who has renewed their friend donation or lake partners this past year. Here's a list of those lake partners, which are businesses who have joined or renewed in the last month since we saw each other last time. Now more than ever, we rely on these donations to continue to advance the important work that we do, like lake improvement projects, educational programming, like this one, and our popular sensor monitoring program, Lake Forecast. If you haven't renewed, we'd love you to join us to help the effort to make Madison Lakes as magical as they should be. Now back to today's talk, which is titled The Beauty and the Basics of Rain Gardens. To tell us more about the topic and introduce our speaker is Stephanie Hayden from Task, our June monthly sponsor. Thank you, Stephanie.
Good morning, everyone. As James shared, my name is Stephanie Hayden, and Task is really excited to once again be a monthly sponsor of the Yahara Lakes 101 Lake Science Cafe. This is the second time we've been a sponsor, and so the first time I was live in person at the Edgewater, so now I'm joining you from my home. Task is proud to sponsor organizations like Clean Lakes Alliance that align with our mission of improving the health, wealth, and well-being of our communities. As James mentioned, today's topic is about rain gardens, and more specifically, how do you create your own? Not only do rain gardens provide an aesthetic improvement, they create wildlife habitat and help filter stormwater before it reaches the lake. Our presenter on this really interesting topic is Paul Skawinski, the state coordinator of the Wisconsin Citizen Lake Monitoring Network. Paul has a great knowledge of native plants and is passionate about butterfly gardening. He is the president of the Central Wisconsin chapter of Wild Ones and also works for the Extension Lakes program at UW Stevens Point. Please join me in welcoming Paul Skawinski.
Thank you, Stephanie. I'm going to pull up my slides here. All right, are you seeing my slides?
Looks good, Paul.
Okay, great. Well, thank you for the invitation. This is definitely my favorite kind of rain garden because rain gardens do a lot of cool things all at the same time. So when I was asked to talk about rain gardens, I very happily offered to do so. So let's see. Okay, so to begin, let's look at a diagram that just shows a comparison between a developed landscape and an undeveloped landscape. And what you see on the left, on the undeveloped side, is that there tends to be many highs and lows in the landscape, and it allows for water to fall on the landscape and not just run quickly down to a lake or a stream at the bottom of the watershed, but it gets captured in various low spots. So each one of those little puddles that forms is able to slowly soak into the ground instead of quickly running down to a lake or a stream. You'll also notice that there's a lot of vegetation on the surface of the land, so that absorbs a lot of the energy from the falling precipitation and lessens the erosive potential of those raindrops and the resulting flow of water across the landscape. The last thing to point out is that on the left, you see a lot of that water actually soaks into the ground and it moves through groundwater into our lakes and streams, which is cleaner than water that just rushes across the landscape and carries soil particles and lawn clippings and other pollutants and things with it. On the right, you see a lot of very flattened land. When we develop areas, we tend to compact them and flatten them, take out most of the vegetation. We usually leave a couple of trees in the landscape, but for the most part, we have a very flat landscape that is more or less resistant to infiltration of water because it's so compacted, and therefore the water tends to run in sheets across the landscape instead of soaking into the ground. So much of our waters then, our lakes and rivers, are then fed by surface water, which is often contaminated with soil particles and other pollutants instead of going through the groundwater and being purified before it reaches the lakes and rivers. So there are many different sources of pollutants out there on the landscape. When we live along a lake, you have to think about all the different things on your property that are contributing pollutants to the lake. And the lake happens to be at the bottom of the landscape where it pretty much collects everything that runs off everywhere else. Many of the chemicals that move across the landscape include things like pesticides and fertilizers, dog waste, lawn clippings. It could be things off your rooftop. It could be metals off of a steel roof, or it could be petroleum products off of an asphalt roof, deck sealers and motor oil off the driveway and brake dust. All of these things are different ways, different things that can pollute the waterways down slope from you. The U.S. Environmental Protection Agency did a study on water pollution and found that about 70% of all water pollution is caused by stormwater runoff. And they also looked at rain gardens as a potential solution to this problem and found that up to 90% of that pollution can be removed through a rain garden. So they're very effective at removing a lot of pollution and allowing that water to soak in and enter our lakes and rivers when it's in a much cleaner state. So this is one responsibility of a homeowner that lives along a lake, or really anyone who enjoys lakes, to try to control your own pollution so that we can all play a part in keeping the waters clean instead of just sending our pollution down to the lake to cause issues or cause problems somewhere else downstream. So a rain garden is basically a small garden. It could be large in some cases, but it's a garden that's designed within a depression in the landscape so that it can contain water, slow it down, and allow it to just soak into the ground instead of running across the landscape. And it could be a natural area, or it could be something that is actually created. You could just dig a hole, plant it, and it could function as a rain garden. So they decrease erosion by trapping that water and preventing it from continuing to flow across the landscape. It decreases the stormwater pollution and also the volume of stormwater, which can become really important when the sewer systems are not able to handle that much flow, or in areas where there's a combined storm sewer and sanitary sewer system, like in Milwaukee, where the treatment plants can't handle all the flow that's coming in after a big storm, and sometimes raw sewage has to be discharged into Lake Michigan because of all that extra flow. So it increases water quality downstream. This is in terms of pollutants like sedimentation. It could be nutrients. It could be all kinds of other pollutants. And rain gardens can provide really anything you're looking for from a garden in general, you can accomplish with a rain garden. Not only will it capture that stormwater and improve water quality, but it can also do many other things. And in this case, this is a late season wall of flowers that's really designed as a screen. Behind this garden is actually a big RV and another house, but you wouldn't really know it standing next to this garden. You would really just be seeing all the colors of the flowers and all the bees and butterflies and things on there. They also provide a lot of wildlife value for all kinds of things, insects and birds and many other things. And they can provide water quality improvements as well, which we've talked about a little bit. So the photo on the right shows a couple of developed areas along a lake where the lawns have been fertilized and are maintained without really any kind of vegetative buffer along the water's edge. And in this particular picture, this is a lake where the soils are fairly heavy, so infiltration is already pretty difficult in that area. It's fairly heavy clay soils. So a lot of the rainfall just falls right over that land and quickly rushes down into the lake. And it carries all the fertilizers that are on these properties as well. Along the lakeshore edge there, you see a bright green line, and that is duckweed, which is a group of small native floating plants. But they're indicators generally of high nutrient conditions or areas of localized high nutrient conditions. So not surprisingly, we see a lot of that right there along the edge because it's capturing a lot of the nutrients that are trying to get into the lake through that landscape. And in the foreground, you can see next to my kayak there, you can see a lot of this stringy algae in the lake, which is also feeding off of the fertilizers that are coming off the land there. This is a lake that I used to fish a lot about 15 years ago, and I used to catch a lot of fish and have a really good time out there. But now if you go there, you can't make a cast in the lake because you'll just catch algae on every cast. So it just gets really frustrating. But you can see what happens when excess fertilizers are continuously pushed into the lake. It turns into a mess of slimy algae mats rather than a healthy looking lake. I imagine they don't run and jump off the dock too much anymore in this site. So here's another example. We have another lawn that's mowed to the edge and trimmed, probably even into the water, it looks like. There's a little goose fence up. They obviously have a goose issue. Geese like to go onto areas of short lawn like that. They feel very safe and free of predators, so they love the wide open view, and they'll come up there and poop all over your lawn. So it's best to have an area of natural vegetation to give the geese a second thought about coming up there on that lawn. And it also holds the shoreline back. So what we've got going on here is that the soil underneath the lawn is being eroded away slowly, and the lawn itself is actually collapsing into the lake. And we see that all the time in lakeshore properties and parks along the water where it's maintained as a lawn. Erosion happens underneath. The roots of those grasses are only a few inches deep. So when that soil gets eroded away, the mass of lawn just collapses into the water. And you can see here that the lake here is very nutrient rich. The plants are extremely thick in there, and that's partially due to the management of the landscape directly above. This is a picture from Northwest Wisconsin when I was out doing an aquatic plant survey with a DNR crew. And this is what we were dealing with on every rake. We had to put the rake in the lake 300 some times to survey all the aquatic plants in the lake. And before you could identify any of the plants, you had to pull this slimy algae off. And it was really a hectic day out there trying to identify these plants with all the algae on them. Here's another example. This is from central Wisconsin, an example of an algae that tends to grow on the bottom of lakes and then rise up to the top as it starts to die and turns into these mats of floating dead algae. So this illustration here shows the root systems of many native prairie plants. Many of these are common rain garden species. And what you see on the left is a scale in feet of how deep these plants are going into the ground to reach water. And you'll notice that many of these reach 6 or 7 or 8 feet into the ground or further. So it's one of the reasons why these native prairie plants need very little maintenance. They don't need a lot of care. They don't need watering and fertilization. They have enough of a root system on their own to find water and to find the nutrients for themselves. And they don't need a lot of help from anyone else in order to survive and to thrive. On the left side, we see Kentucky bluegrass, which is one of our common lawn grasses, and that species has a root system that tends to be about 2 to 3 inches down, and that's why it needs a lot of help from us, because it can't find its own water and it can't find its own nutrients. The top few inches dries up very quickly in the hot summer sun, so you see these lawn grasses tending to go dormant and turn brown in the summer because the conditions really aren't very good for them anymore. And then they'll come back in the fall because the conditions are more favorable for them. Kentucky bluegrass and some of these other turf grasses they're not native around here. They tend to be native to cool, moist areas of the world, and that's perfect for them. But in our case, when it's 90 degrees here in August and July and not raining a lot, the plants are very unhappy, and that's why they tend to go dormant and turn brown. So let's make a little pretend rain garden here, and we're going to start with a typical urban landscape where it's mostly turf and it's fairly flattened. So the first thing to do in creating a rain garden is either looking for an area that's already low and collects water naturally. In this case, we don't have that. It's basically flat all the way across. So we're going to make a rain garden by actually creating a depression in the landscape. So we dug this out. The soil from the rain garden could be used to create a berm around the rain garden and actually make it deeper, or you can take that soil somewhere else, which is what we're going to do here in this example. We're just going to say that that soil moved off site, and we now have this depression. So then we're going to line it with some compost on the bottom. And when I say compost, I mean finished compost. I buy compost from a mass compost producer here in central Wisconsin. And I'm not talking about a pile of rotting yard waste and banana peels. I'm talking about very fine finished compost that really looks like just rich soil. So once you put that down, you mix it in and you create a nice planting bed that's maybe a foot deep of really nice rich soil, a combination of the compost and your native soil there. And then you can start adding plants in. So I have a couple of examples here depicted in the illustration. The sweet black-eyed Susan, which is a Rudbeckia subtomentosa, very similar to the common black-eyed Susan that most people are familiar with, except that this one doesn't tend to get all wilted in the late season like that species can. And that's an example of a pretty dry prairie species. It's important to realize that rain gardens do dry up and in fact are dry most of the time. So you have to plant things that are actually pretty dry tolerant species. And anything you would plant in this example on the other side of the rocks where it's not actually within the rain garden, what you would plant over there is what you should plant in the majority of the rain garden, because they do dry out and they will need to be tolerant of dry conditions. The exception is down at the bottom. You will have the most compost tends to accumulate down there. The most moisture will be retained at the bottom. And so you can usually plant some wetland plants, things like blue flag iris, which is shown in the picture here, many different sedges, or some very showy wetland species like cardinal flower and blue cardinal flower, bottle gentian, things like that. And I've got a bunch of sedges kind of generally depicted in the illustration here, because sedges are a really nice choice for rain gardens because they tend to tolerate a wide range of moisture levels. They also have very large fibrous root systems, so they're very good at absorbing water and pollutants in a rain garden setting. So they're often used in rain gardens for those reasons. You can also see on the picture here, I've got a couple of rocks shown. My favorite way of lining a rain garden is with a border of field stones. I think that looks nice. It looks very natural, but you could use pavers or you could use plastic edging or choose to not have a border at all. It's really up to you. I just tend to use the field stones. Another thing to point out is that rain gardens are not ponds. They tend to hold water for a matter of maybe 10 minutes up to a few hours time. In extreme situations with heavier soil, you might have rain sitting in there for a day, but they do not hold water for very long. My rain garden here at home is about 280 square feet and about 14 inches deep in the middle. And last night we got a 1.61 inches of rain here on our rain gauge. It came over the period of many hours, so we never even had a puddle really forming in the rain garden. It was just kind of a wet spot at the bottom, and it just soaked in as fast as it was coming down. I will show you a video from last summer in a little bit of my rain garden when it did fill up, and you can see how hard it had to rain in order to make that happen. So you need to get the water to the rain garden somehow. And again, if this is a natural low spot in the landscape, it's going to tend to collect water on its own. In this case, we have this flat landscape where we have this man-made depression, and we're going to bring the water to it. So in my case here at home, and what I've done for other people, is to run a downspout either above ground or sometimes an underground pipe that dumps out onto a pad of rocks. And the idea here is to absorb a lot of the erosive potential of the water before it can erode the soil within your rain garden. So you have it dump out onto a pile of rocks so that it can absorb a lot of that energy and then slowly fill up the rain garden without causing a lot of erosion problems. And then you just wait for the rain, and the rain eventually comes and it spills over the rocks and starts to fill in the rain garden. If it's a light rain, it will probably soak in right under the rocks and you'll hardly even ever see the water. If it's a very fast, heavy rain, then it'll start to fill up the rain garden and actually create a small pond for, again, a matter of minutes to a few hours most of the time. Some of the, or one main misconception about rain gardens is that they tend to breed mosquitoes. And people think if you hold water for any length of time, that mosquitoes will instantly find it and then rapidly grow in there and hatch out. And that's not the case. Mosquitoes in Wisconsin, we have many different species of mosquitoes in Wisconsin. They all tend to take at least a full week in the water as a larva before they can hatch out into an adult. And so unless your rain garden is actually holding water for a week, you're very unlikely to be hatching any mosquitoes in there. And what's more likely is that mosquitoes may lay some eggs in your rain garden if it is holding water. And then over the next day or two or less, the water is going to soak in, and those eggs or larvae within the water are just going to dry up and die. So you're not going to be contributing to a larger mosquito population by creating a rain garden. So once you've got the border on there and you've got water coming in, then you just add whatever final touches you like. We have a toad house next to our rain garden, and so you can see our little toad friend there hanging out. And I always tell people when they're designing really any kind of garden, but certainly a rain garden, design it to meet whatever you want from that garden. And it can be many things. So if you want a screen for a certain area of your house, and you also want to capture stormwater, and you want to attract a certain kind of wildlife, you can do all those things at the same time. And try to accomplish as many of those things as you can. It'll just make it that much more fun to watch the garden grow and see all the different things that it can do all at one time. So this is my rain garden here. This is August 1st, a couple of years ago. And you can see that we've marked it out with spray paint about where we're going to put the rain garden. And you can see some other lines there that represents a berm that we're going to create, and also the path that runs through the front yard. At this point, it was all turf. We had a couple of trees that we had to take down, and instead of grinding the stump out, we actually decided we were going to bury that in the berm, which was going to be created with the soil taken out of the rain garden. So it's about 280 square feet, mostly designed as a screen from the road and from other properties for the living room window, which is to the right of the rain garden there, and the front porch, which you can just barely see the step there in the foreground of that picture. So here it is in progress. I had a landscaper help me out with this for a few hours, just for helping with all the soil movement. It saved me a lot of time. And here it is a few months later when it was mostly planted. You can see this is October 1st. If you're familiar with any of these plant species, you'd say, why is purple coneflower and anise hyssop and black-eyed Susan blooming in October? It's because these plants were in pots until middle of August. So they got a late start, and many of these things waited to bloom until they were a little more established. And so they're blooming later than they usually would. And you can see the rain garden here is starting to function. It's holding water. We had a very heavy rain that day, and you can see a nice puddle forming down in the rain garden there. Then the following year, this is what it looked like in mid-June. So this is about 10 months after planting. And these were all planted from plugs, 2.5 by 3.5 inch pots. They were not planted by seed. These were well-established plants that were grown from seed from the spring before. So they had several months to grow in pots and then were put into the rain garden. And here it is a couple months later during a very heavy thunderstorm, very well-established, looking really nice. And here it is the next day after that thunderstorm from the rooftop. So you can see the actual layout of the rain garden there with all the plants blooming. And you can see that rock splash pad there as well, where the water pours out and has most of its energy absorbed before it runs into the garden. So at this point, I'm going to drag my video in here. Can someone just confirm they can see the video window here?
Yeah, we can see it.
Okay, great. So this is actually that storm on August 11th. So here's the water that's blasting out of that downspout. It's hitting the rocks, and you can see it flowing away. It's actually pooling within the rain garden. There is probably a foot of water in the rain garden at this moment in the video. And you can see, looking at the road, the storm, heavy winds and heavy rain blowing across. That was a lot of water. It was about 1.5 inches of rain in about a half an hour. And in order to fill this rain garden up all the way, that's what it takes. So it can take a very heavy storm. All right. And one of the important things to remember about a rain garden is that when it does fill, you have to have a plan for that. Where is that water going to go? If it does fill up all the way, you want to make sure that the low spot of your rain garden is on the side that's away from any structures. So if it does flow over, it can spill out into another area without causing any problems. So in my case, it spills out over the back side of the rain garden. In this photo, there's a river birch tree, and there's some cardinal flowers, and there's some other species that are tolerant of pretty wet conditions. So the extra moisture over there doesn't hurt anything. It actually just makes those plants happier, and it can continue to flow over and soak in throughout that area as well. All right, so much of our focus with our particular rain garden was for butterfly gardening. We designed it as a butterfly paradise right outside of our living room window. And again, I said we also designed it as a screen. And both of those things can certainly be accomplished at once, in addition to accumulating stormwater and treating that. So something to remember as far as butterfly gardening is that we have many butterfly species here in the state, many dozens of butterfly species, and many of them tend to be specialists on a particular species or genus of plants. And everybody knows this example. The monarch butterfly uses anything in the milkweed group. So we have 12 different species of native milkweeds here in Wisconsin. The common milkweed shown on the left, swamp milkweed shown on the right. They use both of those. And if you're looking to support monarchs with your rain garden, then you're going to need to make sure you have some milkweed there so that they can lay eggs on there. The caterpillars can feed on that, and the adults will feed on the flowers of these as well as many other native flowering species. That's also true for many of the other butterflies, like the painted lady here. It's nectaring on a New England aster here in the photo, but on the right side you can see the most common host plant for the painted lady is Pearly Everlasting. Unless you have that species, you won't likely support a lot of painted lady butterflies. So if you want to see a lot of painted ladies hanging around all the time, you need to make sure you're providing the food for their caterpillars, which is the Pearly Everlasting, and also providing a lot of nectar species for the adults to feed on. Here's another example. The black swallowtail likes to, again, nectar on many species as an adult, but it only lays eggs on species within the carrot family. That's the only thing that the caterpillars can eat. So on the left, you see golden Alexanders, which is a typical, fairly common native woodland edge type species. And you can find these caterpillars on anything within that carrot family. So even things in your garden like dill and fennel, parsley, carrots, it likes to lay eggs on any of those things as well, or any of our native plants within the carrot family. And here's another one, the fritillaries. This is an Aphrodite fritillary, I believe. I think so. Could be a great spangled fritillary. But anyway, all the fritillaries feed, again, as adults on many different species, but they only lay eggs on violets. That's the only thing that their caterpillars can eat. Unfortunately, a lot of our violets are eliminated by lawn pesticides targeting broadleaf weeds in lawns. So we're unfortunately eliminating a lot of the food for reproduction of fritillary butterflies. These are about monarch-sized butterflies, just a little bit smaller than a monarch. So they're very impressive butterflies, but we eliminate a lot of their habitat, unfortunately. So sometimes they feed on other things that are not so great, certainly not anything special. This is a viceroy butterfly, which is a mimic of the monarch. The difference is that big, broad, black stripe through the wing there. But you can see they feed on other things as well as flowers. And that includes things like gravel and soil and sand as well, and overripe fruit. They need to get minerals from rocks and from sand or soil, and they will also feed on sugars from ripe fruit. So providing a lot of different resources is important for butterflies in order to provide everything that they need. One of the questions that I've gotten from, or that I got last year anyway, from a neighbor that was walking by was asking about whether I get bugs eating my plants. And the answer is yes, I do see bugs eating my plants, and it makes me happy to know that, because what I'm really trying to do with the gardens here is to attract wildlife, and I need to be able to feed those organisms. If I want to see butterflies, I need to be able to feed the caterpillars of those butterflies. And I want birds to rip apart the seed heads in the garden, and that's really what we're trying to do here, is trying to provide for wildlife. So I don't mind when I see something eating my plants, and typically what you see is the edge of a leaf is chewed up, or there may be a couple of holes within the leaf, and that's okay. I don't mind. Rarely do you see a native insect completely defoliating a plant or causing any real obvious damage within a garden. It's usually the non-native insects like the Japanese beetles that many of you are probably familiar with that cause really big, obvious problems. So I'll go back to that slide there in a second here, but the Japanese beetles there on the left are a non-native insect that eats a couple hundred species of plants. So they're a generalist herbivore. They'll eat almost anything in your garden, and they can certainly be a major pest. And then the oleander aphids are also non-native, and they target milkweeds. So there are these little bright orange aphids that stick a little proboscis into the stem of the plant, and they suck the juices out of the plant and kind of dry it up and suck the resources out. So those can be a nuisance as well. Back to this one, this parsley worm here is actually the larval caterpillar of the black swallowtail. So when I see a parsley worm eating one of my plants, I'm delighted, because I know that means I'm going to be seeing black swallowtails soon fluttering around the garden. So this is a compilation of some of the butterflies we saw here in the rain garden last year. This is not all inclusive, but it's some of the more showy species that we've seen. It includes lots of monarchs and many other of the common groups like the swallowtails and the fritillaries. All right, so now quickly, I want to just talk about some invasive plants. This is a list of many of our common aquatic and wetland and terrestrial species that we deal with a lot in the Midwest here. And what I'm going to do now is highlight the ones in red that we intentionally brought in as gardeners to plant into various garden habitats and then escaped. So you see that this is really a major vector for spreading a lot of these invasives, for introducing them in the first place and also spreading them locally. So it's really a big responsibility of us as gardeners to select things that are not going to become invasive and cause ecological problems down the line. We really don't hear about native species escaping a garden or being released and causing problems because they're already here. And it doesn't matter if they escape from the garden because they're likely already nearby anyway. So we have over 1,000 plant species here that are native to Wisconsin. They don't make good landscaping choices in all cases. A few hundred of them are really nice for landscaping. There's certainly ones that are not really good for landscaping purposes. And we all have to recommend planting the right plant in the right place. No matter what kind of garden you're putting in, this is always important. And in order to create the best garden that's going to thrive the best, you need to make sure those plants are adapted to the right conditions that you're providing. The native plants are definitely the best to support wildlife, and they require very little maintenance once they're established. So you do have to water them every couple of days for a month or two while they get established, and then after that they're pretty much fine to just be out there on their own, and they need almost no care from you. And whatever you're looking for from a garden, whether it's different colors or heights or times of blooming or erosion control, all these things can be addressed with native species. You don't have to go to plants that originate halfway across the world. So when I talk about a native plant, I'm talking about one that naturally grows in your area. I usually think of them at the state level, although you can get more local than that, certainly. And this is a few examples here: cardinal flower on the left, the Ohio spiderwort in the middle, and black-eyed Susan there on the right side. All good choices for rain gardens. And here's a few that go really well in the bottom of a rain garden that are more suited to wet conditions: the New England aster on the upper left, bottle gentian on the lower left, Joe pieweed, which is kind of a big, striking centerpiece type plant, gets about 5.5 feet tall if the conditions are good. Blue flag iris on the bottom center, and then the Bebb's sedge, Carex bebii on the right side, which is a nice small clumping sedge species. Keeping year-round interest is always really important, and value to wildlife. If that's what you're going for, is to feed wildlife, you have to think about what they're going to eat in the winter as well. So you'll want to leave seed heads up, leave them standing throughout the winter so that they provide cover and food for birds. Different berries. This is a winter berry holly in the photo with some asters in the background. Those are all important resources for wildlife over the winter. Now, I wanted to touch on the Healthy Lakes opportunities. This is something through our Extension Lakes program and through DNR, where lakeshore and river shore homeowners can get up to a 75% cost share for practices including rain gardens. So if you live near a lake or a river and you're interested in putting in a rain garden, look into healthylakeswi.com and you can get some cost sharing. There's also cost sharing, I think, and plants available through Dane County. So consider that as well. You may be able to get some assistance with putting in your rain garden. I think I'm running out of time, so I'm going to go quickly through a few of these things. With the Healthy Lakes grants, you can use those funds to hire somebody to make your rain garden, or you could use that money to buy plants and then put it in yourself. So keep that in mind as an opportunity. I think I'm going to blast through the rain barrels part. Something that I've worked with a little bit, combining rain gardens with rain barrels. So I use the overflows to direct water into rain gardens, and it works really well. So you might also have tax credits available for rain barrels or rain gardens through your local municipality, so check into that. If you do need plants, well, you will need plants. When you need plants for your rain garden, you need to think about seeds versus plugs. And you don't want to use seeds to create a rain garden because they tend to get washed down to the bottom of the rain garden. Every time it rains, it just kind of picks up a bunch of seeds, and they're not well established enough usually when the first heavy rain hits. And so a lot of them will die or get moved. So you'll want to use potted plants to create a rain garden. This is a quick example of a garden that I helped put in with plugs. This is not a rain garden. It's just a regular butterfly garden that a school wanted to do here in town. This is 300 square feet and 300 native potted plants. The idea here was to create a very showy garden near the road that was going to fill in quickly and minimize any weeding maintenance. So planting them at 1 per square foot allows them to grow together very quickly and shade out weeds that may be competing with those plants. And so the weeding maintenance is really cut down because the available space and light for weeds to get going is very limited as well. So here it is in May, and then 3 months later, it looked like this. And this is why you use potted plants for gardens if you can afford it, because the results are so fast and the benefits are so quick with these gardens using potted plants. So ultimately, we as gardeners and as lakeshore homeowners and people within each watershed, we all have this choice where we can move lakes and rivers in this toward this kind of state where we have a lot of algae, and in some cases, like you see on the right, the toxic blue-green algae blooms. It's really up to all of us whether we'd like to see our lakes and rivers look like this or look more like this, where the water is clean and the fish and aquatic life are abundant in there. It's up to each one of us in our landscaping choices and what we do on the land, not only at our homes, but also at our places of work and at our parks. Every one of those properties has an influence on our lakes and rivers, and it's up to us to decide which one of those things that we'd like to see. So the answer really is pretty simple. We need to contain that stormwater. We need to filter it out whenever possible, and we need to reduce the amount of stormwater that we have running into our lakes and rivers. The last thing is to reduce pollution through pesticides and fertilizers, and only use chemicals where they're actually needed. Don't use them in excess. Don't use them in areas where they're likely to run off into our surface waters. So it's up to each one of us. And with that, I think I'm right on time. And before we take any questions, I think Luke is going to say a few words on behalf of Clean Lakes Alliance, and then we'll get to the Q&A.
Yes, thank you so much, Paul. While those last questions get put in, I just want to briefly mention a Clean Lakes Alliance initiative. See on the slides here. We, earlier in the year, before times were a little different, we actually collaborated with a variety of amazing organizations across the community here in the Yahara watershed to talk about what are some of the top 10 actions that individuals can take to create a more resilient landscape in the face of climate change challenges like biodiversity loss and water quality issues. So I just wanted to encourage everyone to go to cleanlakesalliance.org top 10 and check out those top 10 actions. They were really discussed with the intention of making it very accessible to almost anybody. And then if you've done some of these things, I really encourage you to fill out the survey on that page and let us know about what you've done. Share your rain garden with us, share your rain barrel. Tell us what you've done, generate some, help generate some ideas. And then if you plan to do some of these things in the summer, you can kind of take that pledge. We really encourage you to do that. And since Paul got to share his rain, I'm going to share my very humble rain garden as an example that you can start small. My wife and I are not landscapers, and we were pretty intimidated about sticking that shovel in the turf. So we wanted to start small, and we were able to create a nice small rain garden. And this year we're really focused on increasing that plant diversity and density. So we're going to continue to develop our rain garden and grow it. And here's the quick, my only action shot, but we actually don't even have downspouts directed into it. It just actually catches a lot of the runoff from our driveway, the sidewalk, and our neighbor's driveway. So not every rain garden has to be this robust, perfectly designed bioretention system, and then we can you can start small and make a positive step. So highly encourage you to check out those top 10 actions. And Adam, now we can address those queses for Paul and get some.
Yeah, some great questions. Boy, great shot at your rain garden, Luke. The water in there, it really shows how well they work, especially when we have tropical storms coming up through Wisconsin these days. So, Paul, we have some great questions for you here. I'm just going to try to rattle through them. One of the first ones that came through, and actually just a very interesting one. Is there any problem with putting a rain garden in the part of the yard where you may have a geothermal system already there?
Yeah, I see the question. I don't know. That's a really good question, and I won't pretend to know the answer to that. It's not something that comes up often, and not something that I've dealt with before. So I won't attempt to have a good answer to that. So I can look into it. I can send a response. If I find some information, I can send it over to Luke and maybe he can pass it along.
Yeah, and I wonder if maybe people who would install geothermal would have an idea on that too.
Sure. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
I did want to mention in Luke's slide before, with his rain garden full of water, you notice, or many of you may have noticed, right behind that was actually a storm drain. So all that water that would have gone into the storm drain was being captured by Luke's rain garden there. At least I think that's a storm drain there, unless it's a garbage can lid on the ground. But all that water is being contained instead of directly just taking pollutants and sediments right through the storm drain into the Yahara Lakes.
That's great.
So
Somebody wanted to know if you could just repeat how deep the compost layer needed to be in a rain garden.
Yeah, it depends on how rich your soil is and also on what kind of plants you're looking to plant into the site. So if you're planning on putting wetland plants in the bottom, it's always a good idea to put a little bit of compost layer in there just to enrich the site a little bit, especially if you have sandy soil. And the depth of the compost could change depending on what you're looking to plant and how rich your soil already is. If it's a very nice silt loam or has some clay in it or something, it's going to absorb moisture fairly well, and so you wouldn't need to put as much compost in there. In my case, with the sandy soil here in central Wisconsin, we put about 3 inches of compost in there and mix it down to a depth of maybe 8 or 9 inches.
Yeah, and the next question kind of leads right into that. I know where you are, a lot more sand up in that part of the state, but down where we are, it's definitely a more soil is a lot more clay based. And the question was, would a rain garden work when the native soil is mostly clay? Like, what is the good ratio of sand and compost when we have that clay soil?
Yeah, so compost can help to increase the infiltration a little bit in clay soils. In general, the recommendation for rain gardens in clay is you should do an infiltration test first. And what that means is basically digging a hole that's the size of a milk jug or a coffee can, that kind of thing, and dig it down maybe 10 inches or a foot, fill that all the way to the top with water, and then see how fast that water drains through. And if you don't get at least an inch per hour of infiltration, then you probably don't want to do a rain garden, because the water is just not going to infiltrate fast enough. And so you'd want to break up that clay a little bit and put some compost in there in order to increase the infiltration rate. Same thing goes for an area with a high water table. A rain garden just isn't really going to do much because the water table is so high and there's just not much ability for the ground to soak much more water.
So that's a good test you should do. Just maybe before you put in any rain garden, is that sort of that milk jug test?
Yeah, and if you know you're on very sandy soil, then you can kind of skip that step. But if you don't know much about the type of soil that you're on or how quickly it infiltrates, you could kind of guess, if you see it after it rains, if the water just puddles on your lawn for a day, your soil is probably pretty heavy. If you never see puddles on the lawn, then you probably have a fair bit of sand.
Another question about the deer-resistant plant options in a rain garden, if you want to keep them away. So there's some plants that deer would not want to go towards.
Yeah, so anise hyssop is a really nice one. The hyssops tend to have a pretty strong odor to them. The anise hyssop smells like anise, and deer do not like to eat that one. Neither do rabbits. Rattlesnake master is another one that is fairly tolerant of a wide range of moisture conditions, and deer and rabbits tend to not like that one either. I've seen prickly pear cactus used around the outside of a rain garden, and that certainly works well. Nothing eats that. And as far as deer resistance goes, the deer, if they're really a problem in an area, they will eat almost anything. Right. Much of the time, from my experience, they will munch off the top, and they'll eat the tender part at the top, which ends up not killing the plant, but creating a more shorter, bushier form of the plant. The plant will, when it has its head cut off, if you will, it tends to send off side shoots and create a bushier form. And so a little bit of natural pruning is not necessarily a bad thing. But yeah, I would recommend the rattlesnake master and the anise hyssop as two that even in the worst deer pressure environments are great choices. And there are many other ones that are sort of deer resistant, but if the pressure is really high, then they'll still nibble on them. And right. Again, it's not always the worst situation. Sometimes they're just eating a little bit of it, and it won't ultimately hurt the plant all that much.
Somebody else had a pretty good question here, wondering if you needed to weed a rain garden initially to remove the shell of rooted weeds so the dominant deep-rooted weeds can establish. Is that something you need to do in the beginning, or can you stop that at a certain time?
Yeah, with any garden, it's important to remove those weeds at least the first year. And as I showed in that example before, if you plant them at 1 per square foot, they tend to be pretty much grown together and really filled in by the end of the first growing season. So at that point, there are not a lot of weeds that are growing within that area. But before that happens, you have to pull those weeds out. A lot of our annual weeds that are problems in garden sites tend to be stimulated to germinate by light. And if they don't have a lot of bright light, because it's blocked out by all the other plants surrounding them, then you won't have a lot of germination of those annual weeds. And typically after the first season, if they're planted densely, you only have to weed around the outside where there's a lot of light stimulating those weed seeds to germinate.
Somebody wanted to know if the water table is 40 inches down. Is that a problem for a rain garden, or is that deep enough?
I don't think so. That's plenty of room for infiltration, especially if it's a shallow, a sandy area. The water will soak down into the water table and then disperse. So that would be plenty of room for a rain garden.
Somebody had another good question. Can a rain garden work in a very shady area? And if it does, are there plants that work a little better in that shaded area?
Yep, definitely. So a rain garden can go anywhere. It's really just the right plant in the right place again. If you are putting a rain garden in a shady area, it can be pretty much the same design. It just needs to have plants that are adapted to shade. So things at the bottom in the more wet area would be things like sweet Joe pieweed, which is a shorter version, a different species. It's about a 3 foot tall species of Joe pieweed. The blue flag iris is fairly shade tolerant, and there's a bunch of sedges like the Pennsylvania sedge and Bebb's sedge that can both tolerate some shade. Those would be good ones along the outside. Bottle brush grass is a really nice shade species that can go at the bottom. That's about a 4.5 foot tall grass with a very showy seed head. So any of those would be great options.
So the height of the plant actually kind of leads into the next question. Someone was wondering, are there great low-lying vegetation options so maybe it wouldn't detract from your view of the lake or view you would have?
Yes, that's where a lot of those sedges really come in handy, because many of them are 1 to maybe 2.5 feet tall. So a lot of people use a very heavy majority of sedges in their rain gardens or along the shoreline for that reason. Sedges and different the native blue flag iris species that we have here are all good ones. Occasionally the irises will get maybe 3 or 4 feet tall. Yeah, so either of those would be good options. The anise hyssop I mentioned before tends to get about 2.5 feet tall. That's a nice one. And many of the asters can grow fairly tall, but they're all very tolerant of trimming. So if you want your garden to be shorter, but you still like some of these showy aster species to bloom in the fall, you can cut them back in July to 6 or 8 inches tall, and they'll regrow, but they won't grow as tall as they would have otherwise been. So you can keep your plants pruned down to a couple feet tall, even though they might naturally grow to maybe 4 feet tall.
Any idea for those? I have irises in my garden, and after I've split it, I think twice, but it's a plant that's been established for 10 years, and at the bottom I have this like thick base that I can't seem to get rid. I mean, is there a way that pruning to prevent that thick base on some of those perennials that you keep coming back, or like a hosta where you need to split it or something?
Well, as the plant gets more mature, it's going to create a thicker, more robust crown like that. So there's not much that you're going to do to prevent that from happening. It's just kind of a plant's growth habit naturally. So there isn't a whole lot you're going to be able to
fair
do.
enough. We had a couple questions about mulch. Someone wanted to know, or a couple people, is there need to mulch a rain garden, or does it make sense to put mulch in after that initial planting?
Yeah, you can. I don't, because most wood mulches will float. And so if you have a rain garden that fills with water, now your mulch is moving all over the place, and it covers the plants and it weighs them down. So once the rain stops, you'll see your plants are all laying on their sides because they're weighted down by all the wood mulch that's stuck to them. So in general, I don't like to use mulch. If you found a mulch that doesn't float, then that would be an option, or you could use a rock mulch. and that would be an option as well. Rock mulches look pretty nice actually in rain gardens, but I would stay away from using wood mulch because of the ability for it to float up and move around.
Right. So we'll still check this, but we did have a participant say that they've heard that it's fine to have the extra water entering the soil above a geothermal field because it actually resets the soil temperature, but just have to be careful not to hit the piping, and that there's contractors to pack stuff around it. But I think we'll still check that. I just wanted to point that out, that we had a participant say that. I think we've torn through most of the questions. Some other people have had questions about specific nurseries that have rain garden native plants, and I think we have we posted a plant guide link on the webinar chat here that has some great native plants. And then nurseries in town, I think depending on where you live, it's probably just best to go to your specific nursery and ask them. Unless, Paul, do you have any other advice on procuring plants?
Yeah, a couple of suggestions. The DNR does maintain a native plant nursery list on their website. So if you go to the DNR's website and just type in native plant nursery, you'll find a list that's usually updated a few times a year. And there are more native plant nurseries popping up all the time around the state. There are a couple that are in the Madison area. I also would definitely encourage you to go wherever you normally would buy plants. Go in there and ask them about native plants, because they will start stocking them if they start hearing demand from people. So if you have one that's just down the road, encourage them to start stocking natives so that they can gain more of your business. I see the other part of that question is about plant sale fundraisers. Wild Ones has chapters around the state. We do have a plant sale fundraiser as our chapter in the spring, but other chapters around the state also do those. So you can look into your local Wild Ones chapter. There is one in the Madison area, and look into their plant sale. The Madison Arboretum has a plant sale with native species, and the Plant Dane program would be another option, where I believe it's Dane County Land and Water Conservation puts on this native plant sale and gives away some for free too, I think. So look into all those options.
Sure. One more quick question we had here, or two quick questions. One person asked a question about planting a rain garden on a slope, if that would be possible. And then one other person asked about, is it okay to put a small tree in a rain garden? I want to make sure we cover
Okay,
up on that.
yeah, so with the slope, you'd want to do what I mentioned before about digging the soil out and then using it as up on a berm. So you can dig into the slope and you can put your soil that you excavate on the downslope side. So it creates a somewhat flat rain garden area within a slope. And so that's the best way to do it, is to dig a depression, use that soil on the downstream side to raise up the downslope area, and then you can have your rain garden. I forgot what the other question was.
Can you put a small tree in a rain garden?
Oh, yeah. So trees and shrubs can be used usually on the outside of a rain garden. They're usually not recommended for the middle of the rain garden. Typically, it's herbaceous plants in the middle, and then the trees and shrubs along the outside. So their roots can still get kind of underneath the rain garden and still contribute to absorbing the water and the nutrients from the rain garden itself, but they're within outside the perimeter of the rain garden itself.
I mean, we got 2 minutes here. I'm going to try to power through these. How close to a concrete lake wall can you put a rain garden, you think?
Well, I don't have a lot of experience with that. I would be a little concerned about destabilizing a concrete seawall if you're excavating behind it. So I would probably say you should talk to a lakeshore restoration consultant about that question. I don't want to make a bad recommendation on that. Sure. So I would be a little bit careful about it. I'd talk to someone who specializes in that kind of thing.
One more quick question. Any suggestion on how to set up the berm so it doesn't have runoff issues? And then that's gonna be our last question.
If you do have a berm set up, if that's within the rain garden, you probably don't really want to mulch it. So you'd want to have a lot of plants kind of covering that area. So a ground cover type species would be really nice to absorb a lot of energy and reduce runoff. If that's a berm that's next to the rain garden but not really within it, you could put a wood mulch down, so that would that would absorb a lot of the rainfall impact, and wouldn't actually be within the rain garden, so we wouldn't have to worry about the wood mulch floating. But those could be a couple of good options there.
All right, well, we are at 9 o'clock. I want to thank Paul so much for this fantastic presentation. Really quickly, Eric Olson from the Lakes Extension Program has posted some links in the chat about DNR cost sharing projects and some garden related resources. So if you check out the chat portion here, you should be able to get some more. And I know this has been a topic a lot of people have asked us about since we've really pushed rain gardens as a great way people can help the lakes at home. Thanks again to all our sponsors. Of course, really quickly, if you haven't registered for our Loop the Lake bike ride, it's virtual. You can do it in your own neighborhood, walk, run, bike, paddle, rollerblade, whatever you want and at any length. And your registration still gets you that really nice shirt. And all the registration money will then come back to Clean Lakes Alliance, and we'll use it to support lake improvement projects, educational programming like this, and citizen monitoring. So again, the citizen monitoring, our lake forecast app is up. You can download it for free in both the Android and the Apple store. And it's a great way to check 70 points around all 5 lakes. So we have our citizen monitors checking that water quality at least twice a week. I want to thank everybody again so much for joining us. We have our next Yahara Lakes 101 in July, and that date is July 8th, I believe, which is a Wednesday. And we'll send out information to everybody on that shortly. And the video you had today, we will send out to everybody too, so the slides will all be included. Thanks so much, everybody, and have a great day.